All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a pretty unconventional map of early American legal history. We're going to examine the foundational era of the United States, specifically the period between 1774 and 1783, exactly as it's laid out in our source documents. And I gotta tell you, these texts present some highly specific frameworks that might just completely flip what you thought you knew about American history on its head. So let's get into it. Here's the roadmap for where we're headed. We'll start with Congress and the initial push for independence, look closely at the Declaration itself, touch on the War for Independence, and then dive into state formation and early self-governance. After that, we'll wrap up with the end of the conflict and, ultimately, what all of this signifies. Okay, part one, Congress and the move to independence. The source texts map out a really rapid sequence of dominoes falling here. It kicks off with the Continental Congress in 1774. Just a year later, in 1775, Benjamin Franklin is appointed as the first Postmaster General. This momentum rolls straight into the Declaration of Independence in 1776, leads to the Articles of Confederation in 1781, and finally wraps up with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. But, you have to wonder, what exactly triggered this incredibly fast chain reaction? Well, Benjamin Franklin actually made a really fascinating claim about the real catalyst for the war. He pointed to the British Currency Act. This act banned the colonies from issuing their own paper money and demanded that all taxes be paid strictly in gold and silver. Basically, overnight, colonial scrip became totally worthless. According to the source texts, it was this massive economic control and the devastating depression that followed that was the actual prime reason for the Revolutionary War. That brings us to part two, the Declaration of Independence. Now, most of us just see the Declaration as this bold political statement, right? But the documents frame it in a much more literal, legal way. They describe it as an action at common law. It was serving as a formal, literal indictment against King George III. And critically, it established the nation's genesis specifically on the land and soil jurisdictions. So what were the specific crimes listed in this legal indictment? We all know about taxes without consent, but the authors place a huge emphasis on judicial overreach. Just imagine being completely denied a trial by your peers. Or worse, being physically transported, literally shipped beyond the seas, just to be tried under foreign Roman civil or admiralty law. That was the grim reality for the colonists, and it was a major breaking point. Moving on to part three, the War for Independence. Once the armed conflict actually kicked off, the texts frame the combatants in a way you probably haven't heard before. For instance, when unconquered native nations engaged in battle, the sources claim they weren't actually fighting the true American government. Instead, they were fighting the United States of America Incorporated, which is described in these texts as a rogue British territorial government acting as a service vendor. Pretty wild distinction, right? But that leaves us with a huge logistical puzzle. If the colonists were busy fighting this overarching corporate entity, how on earth were they managing their day-to-day lives without a centralized king calling the shots? Let's explore that in part four, state formation and self-governance. The answer, it turns out, was hyper-localized self-governance. Citizens relied heavily on something called 100 courts. Picture this. Local groups made up of roughly 100 families where folks would gather to settle internal disputes. And they did this strictly using common law, completely bypassing any sort of centralized judicial interference. It was pure grassroots problem solving. This represented a massive philosophical shift. In Europe at the time, sovereignty sat squarely on the head of a prince or king. But the sources point out that over in America, sovereignty devolved directly down to the people. Everyday citizens became, as the texts put it, sovereigns without subjects. Any elected governors or rulers, they had zero personal power. They were viewed merely as agents acting on behalf of the sovereign people. To make this decentralized system work, the sources categorize the era's legal documents very specifically. The 1781 Articles of Confederation, that recognized free inhabitants. The 1787 Northwest Ordinance, that provided the actual procedure for organizing free states. But here's the real kicker. The 1787 Constitution is categorized by the texts merely as a commercial service contract. It was just a delegation of powers for a federal republic that the authors actually claim is currently dormant. All right, part five, the end of the conflict. As the actual fighting wound down, getting international legal recognition was the final crucial hurdle. The 1783 Treaty of Paris was that definitive moment. That's when King George III legally recognized the states on the land and soil as absolute, free, sovereign, and independent states. Now, this next concept is a major claim in the source documents, and it has to do with the American civilian peacetime flag. The texts emphatically state that the actual foundational American government has literally been at peace since 1814. According to this view, any use of a war flag since then is just an aberration by foreign federal subcontractors. Finally, Part 6, Significance and Summary. Let's tie it all together. So the texts outline a very strict three-step genesis of the nation. Step 1, the unanimous Declaration of Independence. Step 2, victory by force of arms. And Step 3, the peace process to establish treaties. The absolute key takeaway here is that this entire three-step process completely predates and operates entirely independently from the later federal constitutions. When you look at how these foundational laws are categorized in the texts, there's a very clear split. The Declaration of Independence is treated as the true genesis on the land and soil. The Articles of Confederation protected the privileges of free inhabitants, and the constitutions? They are viewed strictly as service contracts for delegated powers, meaning they are entirely separate from the sovereign people. Ultimately, the source documents make one overarching, unavoidable claim. The foundational American government stands entirely under the Declaration of Independence. Period. According to this perspective, that makes it completely separate and distinct from the United States federal government, which, again, exists only to administer those delegated contracts. Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to ponder as we wrap up. If we view the true foundation of sovereignty as resting entirely on the Declaration and the people, and we view the constitutions merely as commercial service contracts, how does that fundamentally reshape your understanding of American legal history? It's a perspective that definitely challenges the conventional narratives. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.